In the year 610, at the age of 40, Muhammad, on a family pilgrimage in the spring to Mount Hira, not far from their home in Mecca, found himself meditating alone in a cave and experienced a revelation to him of a God that is invisible, intangible, all-encompassing, all-merciful, the kind of God that Jews and Christians had preached for centuries by then, but which in the environment in which Muhammad grew up was the exception, not the rule. He came back to Mecca and he began to preach new doctrines that resulted from a constant sense of revelation of that God to himself. And by the year 622, found it necessary and desirable to migrate north of Mecca some 280 miles, some 401 kilometers or so, to a town called Yathrib that later on would be called Al-Madinah, the city, because of its importance in his life, where he began to adjudicate between problems that tribes within that town were having with each other, and at the same time formulating both a political and a religious basis for what he began to call Islam. And from Medina, from Yathrib, around 627, 628, made his way back to Mecca, took Mecca, and by the time of his death in 632, that whole area known as the Hijaz, between Mecca and Medina and their environs in the central western portion of the Arabian Peninsula, had become Islamized. The inhabitants had become mostly Muslim, a word that means submitter or committer. Islam means submission or commission to the will of God, to the will of Allah, as the word God is offered in Arabic. It is a faith that is centered on 5 principles, 5 pillars. The pillar of belief that there is no God but God, that Muhammad is the seal and the final messenger, the final prophet, after a long list of prophets that begins with Adam and continues with Abraham and Moses and encompasses Jesus and John the Baptist and a whole range of others. Muhammad is the culmination of that. The second pillar is the pillar of prayer, that one prays formally 5 times a day. The third, that one fasts from sunrise to sunset during the course of the month of Ramadan. The fourth, that one give charity to those who have less than one has. And the fifth, that if at all possible, one make a pilgrimage in the course of one's life to Mecca, and from Mecca to Medina and back to Mecca again. These principles are nowhere laid out precisely, but are to be found encompassed in the primary text of Islam, the first of which is called the Quran, a term meaning recitation. It refers to Muhammad's recitation of principles and issues and ideas that have come to him from God through the agency of the angel Gabriel. And in addition to the Quran, the Hadith, a series of sayings and stories about the Prophet or coming from the Prophet, but ascribed to himself, as opposed to the Quranic statements that are ascribed to God through the Prophet. So Quran and Hadith become the textual basis for an Islam which within a decade after the Prophet's death had swallowed up by 643 or so the Sasanian Empire, the last of the great Eastern Persian imperia, and by 720 or so encompassed from Spain to India, from the Pyrenees to the Himalayas, within its sway of influence. So Islam would be found across those vast territories. Islam would encounter then the Byzantine Empire and finally dismantle it in 1453. Islam would encounter and have constant conflict and contact with the world of Christendom across the Mediterranean, from Spain to the Holy Land to Sicily and southern Italy in between. And an obvious question within this context should occur to us, and that is, well, what then of Islamic art, which would be in contact with Christian art, but which would, by definition, have an obviously different basis with respect to its inherent nature. If Christianity views God as assuming human form, then Christian art, as we have seen, can represent God, can represent the Sakher in human and certainly in figurative representational form. Whereas we might expect for Islam that, like Judaism, adheres to a belief in God as invisible, as never assuming any kind of visible, much less human form, we might assume of it that it not only cannot represent God, but that it may not offer figurative representation at all. If we look at the outset of where Islam might have found for its beginnings and look in the large sense at architecture, then we turn to the image of the Hagia Sophia, which of course is a church of holy wisdom built in the 6th century by Justinian, the Byzantine emperor, which would become in 1453, some 9 centuries later, when Islam in the form of the Ottoman Turks would finally take Constantinople. The city would eventually be renamed Istanbul, and so this church would become a mosque. So we see around it a series of 4 minarets, 4 towers, that aside from offering an inherent kind of geometric contrast between the upward form, the slender, almost phallic form of the minaret, and the swelling, almost pregnant belly form of the mosque dome itself, that aside from that offers us an equivalent in the contrast between the structure and the minarets to the church, and the contrast between the body of the church and the church tower. For indeed, as the church tower is designed with its bells to call the faithful to worship, so the minarets up which the muezzin, the callers to prayer, would climb 5 times a day, would remind the faithful that it is important to pray when the time comes. On the interior, eventually the Muslims would cover over the colorful Christian figurative mosaics with whitewash. But when this mosque in turn became a public museum, when modern Turkey in 1922 became not the Ottoman Turkish Muslim state, but the secular state of Turkey, whose inhabitants are mostly Muslim, as it turns out. So the interior would then be opened up again, but we can still get a sense of how the Muslim conquerors, how the Ottoman Turks incorporated small transformations, the addition of a minbar, of a pulpit, towards what was the apse before and subsequently becomes the site of the mihrab, a term which I will define before this lecture is out. Also, around the periphery, 4 large tablets, circular tablets, tandos, on which are written the names of the 4 original companions, the 4 original caliphs of Islam, that also correspond, of course, to the 4 minarets on the outside, which in turn correspond to the 4 directions that define human reality. Now, we recall that the Hagia Sophia dome itself represented a carrying forth of a tradition architecturally that began with the Roman Pantheon, this notion of a free-standing domed structure, but that Justinian had changed some of the details. That is, the dome form became flattened. That is, instead of a singular oculus at the upper reaches of the Pantheon, we have a series of openings, of windows that both connect the dome to and separate it from its support structure. And this idea of a dome, hundreds and hundreds of years before Hagia Sophia would become a Muslim mosque, is first seen in Islamic architecture in Jerusalem, in the Dome of the Rock developed by Abd al-Malik around 691, to mark a spot which has a threefold importance for Islam. It has the importance of being the site where some Muslims believe, and not all, that Abraham offered his son, just as Jews and Christians believe that. Muslims are divided over the course of their history as to whether that son is Isaac or Ishmael. In contemporary Islam, most Muslims understand it to have been Ishmael. But at the time of Abd al-Malik's dome, it was not clear to everyone which son, and this site was considered important for that reason. It was considered important for a second reason, that it marked the place where the son of David, Solomon, had built his temple, and David and Solomon are among the prophets respected by Islam, together with others like Abraham, Moses, John, and Jesus. But the third, the most important reason for Islam to mark this spot is that according to a hadith according to one of the traditions about Muhammad, on a single night, he took a ride from Mecca to Jerusalem, called the sacred Al-Quds, from Mecca to Al-Quds, to heaven and the throne of God, back to earth and back to Mecca, a single night ride called the Mir'aj, the ascent, the Isra, the night ride on his steed, his talking steed Burak. This miraculous event has therefore this site as the meeting point between Saker and Profanos, between heaven and earth. His point of departure from earth to heaven, his point of return from heaven to earth, is the site of this rock. And so the dome of the rock, this is not a mosque, it is a monument, was built by Abd al-Malik. It was built also with a political angle in being closer to his, Abd al-Malik's, capital in Damascus than Mecca and Medina. It gave a greater stature to a third central site for Islam and its relationship with God that was closer, as a practical matter, to Damascus. And we recognize that he's taken the domed idea, he's elevated it, and he's placed it clearly above and resting on top of what we see as an octagonal structure, which in turn rests on a squared base, so that we have then a kind of dynamic contrast between the dome that, as with the Hagia Sophia and as with the Pantheon, mimics, emulates the dome of heaven, and so symbolizes heaven in a certain sense, and the squared platform, which in its four-sidedness echoes in symbolic terms the four directions of profane, profanos, of earthbound reality, intermediated by the octagon that not only intermediates in form between square and circle, but in fact represents, if one thinks about how one gets to an octagon, a square superimposed on a square and turned one over the other 45 degrees. That gives one an eight-pointed star, the interior of which is an octagon. Now, the significance of this, of course, is that if God is the opposite of what we are, God is invisible, intangible, singular, we are visible, tangible, multifarious, at the same time, we might assume, we might believe that God must be in some sense like us because we must be like God, because God is within us, so we have Godness within us. Well, in that case, the four-directioned reality of our world must, in a sense, be echoed and echo, in turn, a reality of God's which could be construed as four-directioned. But the realities can't be the same, so we take one and superimpose it over the other, turn it 45 degrees, and we have a statement of the relationship between God and ourselves in abstract terms. And in this case, the abstract terms that intermediate between the full squared base below and the sphere above. Moreover, as we look at the details of the Dome of the Rock, we realize that there is a dialogue as well between monumental and minute elements, the dome soaring in its undifferentiated coloration over a structure which is endlessly broken up by different details, and that the details contrast with each other in terms of colors, green and blue, white and black, in terms of forms, arches and smaller arches that not only echo each other but ultimately echo the form of the dome, contrasts between rectilinear and geometric elements and curvilinear and vegetal elements, and the whole conceived in a series of abstractions that refer both to the colors and to the various forms, both to the colors and forms and to the calligraphy that works its way around the upper reaches of the octagon and the lower reaches of the dome, giving us text together with image, the texts from Quran and Hadith, which are themselves in visual terms a kind of abstract sort of decoration. And we can see this kind of an idea carrying forward in Islamic art as we move all the way to the 18th century, some 1100 years later, to the period of the Safavid dynasty in Isfahan in Persia, where we are looking at the Madarishah Madrasa, so this is a school attached to a mosque, and we see the same general principles. We see the dome. We see the dome echoed by the arch just below, and within that arch another archway. In fact, this is called an iwan. It is a directional archway that takes us in toward the mosque beyond the school and within the mosque to the point of orientation in the direction of Mecca. And we see the whole structure counterpointed with this pair of minarets that rise left and right to either side of the Iwan. We recognize the monumental scale broken up into an infinite array of minute details. And so we also understand a kind of paradox, analogous to that paradox to which I referred earlier, of taking a square and superimposing it over another square to give us an eight-pointed structure that gives us both God's reality as like ours and unlike ours. Well, consider monumental minute in that sense. The minute decorations go on forever and ever. They have an infinitizing quality. God is infinite. And yet in being minute, they're like us. The monumental element is like God in being monumental. And yet if we look at the framing of the Iwan, which is decorated as the dome is, then the frame is circumscribed as we are, even though it is the monumental element as God is, on which the decoration is both minute like we are and infinitizing as God is. So this kind of a dialogue between different elements that expresses the relationship between God and ourselves in purely abstract terms is to be found across the Muslim world with diversities of detail that are accounted for by diversity of time and place. If we look to India, to among the most famous of Muslim structures, the Mughal period Taj Mahal, that was built by Shah Jahan between 1631 and about 1648 to 51, there is some question as to exactly when it was completed. We are looking at a monument which is a tomb. It's not a mosque, it's not a madrasa, it's not a monument to an event such as the Dome of the Rock is. It's a tomb, but of course we already know that all of these kinds of structures are analogs of each other in terms of marking border passages between one reality and the other, between living and dead, human and divine, and so on. And so this tomb, this spectacular tomb, offers us once again a dome that rests on an octagonal kind of complexity, that rests in turn on a squared base, flanked at the four corners by four minarets, the domes echoed by smaller domes at the four corners of the octagonal base, as it is echoed by smaller domes on the peaks of the minarets, as it is echoed by the arches, the large Iwan-like arch and the smaller arches that work their way around the periphery, the monumental structure offering minute details, and the whole thing reflected in a reflecting pool that offers yet another level of divine-human interface. Compared to the reflection that moves and scintillates and is never still, the structure appears so solid. But we understand that the water in which the reflection is to be found is part of God-made nature, which is far more enduring in the long run than any human-made structure, even a magnificent contrivance such as the Taj Mahal. So again, a kind of play on the matter, in this case, of that which is solid and enduring and that which is not solid and does not endure, as a statement of the relationship between human and divine. Now, within a mosque, one must be praying, ideally 5 times a day, toward Jerusalem when Muhammad was still shaping Islam. But by 627, 628, as he took Mecca, the orientation, and the word in Arabic is Qibla, the Qibla towards Jerusalem became the Qibla towards Mecca. And so in every mosque across the planet, one finds a wall called the Qibla wall in which a mihrab, a niche, orients the devotee towards Mecca. So here at the opposite end of the Muslim world from India, we've come to Spain, to Cordoba, and to a mihrab built in the late 9th, early 10th centuries during the Umayyad period, directing the prayerful towards Mecca. And once again, we recognize on a smaller scale, monumental and minute. So look at the arch around the mihrab, and it is broken up into 19 components, each one decorated differently, all of them infinitizing kinds of decorations, and all of them frame by frame. And 19, of course, is not an arbitrary choice. It is said that the first prophecy from God to Muhammad was articulated with 19 words. The words that open up just about every passage, every surah, every chapter of the Quran, in the name of God, the merciful and beneficent, Bism Allah al-Rahman wa Rahim, is given by way of 19 consonants. so that 19 has an important and mysterious kind of quality, bespeaking the connection between human and divine. And we see of this mihrab not only the large arch with its decoration thus subdivided, within we see smaller arches, trilobed arches, and we see once again calligraphy just around the lower part of the 19-part decoration that separates the lower from the upper. We also notice a pair of columns left and right, which allude to the same thing that the pair of columns alludes to in Jewish and Christian art. It alludes to the temple in Jerusalem. So we have in this mihrab both the obvious references towards Mecca, but also the references towards Jerusalem. And we are reminded that the mihrab itself is a lineal descendant of the Torah niche, as we have earlier seen in this example from Duryopus of the 3rd century, that orients the praying Jew towards Jerusalem, and similarly the apse, an even grander orientation niche that orients the praying Christian towards Jerusalem. And just as the Torah niche and the apse not only orient the praying toward their goals of connectedness between earth and heaven, but are decorated with elaborate imagery that connotes the redemptive salvational quality of God, if one thinks of the mihrab, one realizes the inscriptions and the symbolic handling of color and form and number symbolism is also about salvational kind of, redemptive kind of thinking. Now, if one is praying 5 times a day, it may not be possible to be at the mosque all the time. So one seeks to create an area in which one can pray that is separate from the earth around one, because Muslim prayer calls for going down on the knees and putting the head to the ground, and so one needs to be separated from profane space. In Ottoman Turkey, there developed the prayer rug, which offers a particularly exquisite means of separating oneself from the profane earth. So from Gorgish in the 18th century, we see a prayer rug before us on the screen, the mihrab, the niche right there before us, framed by a 7-fold series of frames alluding to the notion of 7 heavens. 7 is, as we have seen, an important number going back to pagan antiquity, coming through Judaism and Christianity, found as well in Islam. And here the mihrab is flanked by the same pair of columns in stylized form that suggest Jerusalem, and hanging, as it were, within the niche is a stylized rendering of a lamp. And in fact, every mihrab in the Muslim world, in every mosque, will be hung with 1 or more lamps, as we see here exemplified by a lamp that is Ottoman Turkish and comes from the year 1549, that offers us a contrast between positive and negative space. You look at the white in one way and it appears to be the main theme, and the green and blue are subsidiary. You adjust your eyes and the blue and green become the main coloristic theme, and the white becomes subsidiary. The white is moreover filled on the lower portion with a series of what are called stylized cloud motifs, ultimately derived from China to Persia to Ottoman Turkey. And with inscriptions once again, interestingly in this case, a 3-fold series with upper, middle, and lower inscriptions, Quran, Hadith to be expected, but the lower inscription gives us the identity, the poor and humble muesli of the potter who made it, the date and place, which is why we can say that it comes from Iznik, that it is precisely from 1549. And we're reminded both of the notion that the passage in the Quran that calls for such a lamp likens the world to a niche and God's light to that of a lamp. And we're also reminded of the fact that the eternal light as a representation of God's presence is found before the Torah niche, the Holy Ark, in the Jewish synagogue, and lamps are similarly found to represent God's presence before the apse in many different kinds of churches. But if we look at this calligraphy, we're reminded that as an important element of Muslim decor, calligraphy develops its own style and vocabulary. The standard form in which Quranic passages are typically written is called Kufic because it developed in a town in Iraq called Kufa. But eventually, by the 10th century, there are, in addition to that kind of squared form, a series of 6 major cursive forms and then dozens A variance will evolve over time. No example of calligraphy as an art form, however, is more interesting, more spectacular than in the tura, the signature of the Ottoman sultans, such as we see exemplified before us here. This is the tura of the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the key figure of the 16th century, whose forces by 1527 had gotten as far as Vienna, and who in this tura is signing a document of correspondence with the French king, Francis I, in which they are discussing cultural exchange. So Islamic art that we began by asking about in terms of figuration shows itself to be largely aniconic, non-figurative in preference, from calligraphy to abstraction. So we turn to the so-called Salon of the Ambassadors at the Alhambra in Granada, a structure of the 14th century from the Nasrid dynasty there. And in this extraordinary stucco cupola up towards which we look, we see once again the eight-starred or octagonic kind of formulation. We see once again monumental stretches of ceiling and dome broken up by infinitizing minute details. We see the play of light and shadow, of dark and light, within this all-white kind of contrivance. We also recognize at the edges what are called muqarnas, these little stalactite kinds of formations that, hanging from places where the ceiling and the wall meet, obscure precisely where that line is. So muqarnas not only offer us another example of a monumental space broken up into minute details, but in obscuring the border between, let's say, ceiling and wall, are part of the question of where the border falls between God and ourselves. So calligraphy, so abstract geometric form, so abstract vegetal and floral kind of forms. If we look at another prayer rug, this one from the 16th century, another Ottoman prayer rug, we recognize that the entire mihrab is filled up with a stylized representation of vegetal and floral forms that suggests a garden of paradise, that suggests a tree of life, that suggests that when I kneel within that mihrab praying towards Mecca and thinking of God and thinking of Mecca and thinking of Al-Quds, Jerusalem, of thinking of those connections between heaven and earth, that for a moment I'm really in paradise itself. But here's the thing. We also find representational art within Islam. In one of the earliest mosques, the Great Mosque of Damascus, in the year 715, indeed, over the central doorway, we have a spectacular series of mosaics that offer us a landscape with architectural and vegetal elements that recalls Roman 2nd, 3rd, 4th style wall paintings, and in being mosaic, probably not only emulated the Byzantine proclivity for mosaics, but it may well be that Byzantine craftsmen were put to use in creating this image. But Islamic art also goes beyond the representational toward the figurative. So in illuminated manuscripts, such as this translation of a Greek medical text by Dioscorides, the De Materia Medica, we see the physician Erostratos reclining and his assistant discoursing to him. So we see two figures, and we notice of them, by the way, that they have halos around their heads. Well, physicians are sacerdotal. They're like priests, pharaohs, kings. They intermediate between the possibilities of life and death, and so we find them with the same sort of sunburst element that we've seen in Christian art, just as we see these figures in dialogue, so to say, visually, with the text, which is the material under discussion here. But we even find illuminated manuscripts that offer us the Prophet Muhammad, as we see here, on his way on a journey, accompanied by Abu Bakr and Ali, two of the four original caliphs, his two most important first followers, in a manuscript that comes from a series called The Life of the Prophet from the end of the 16th century, 1594-5. And again, we see landscape, although flat. We see halo, but a soaring, flaming halo, which is the more typical halo, particularly when the prophet is represented haloed. And yet we see the prophet with his face covered up, so we see him, but we don't see him, although there are also images where we actually see the prophet's face. And in fact, we see the faces of caliphs in the form of the Ottoman sultans, who took very quickly to the notion of portraiture, beginning with Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror, who in 1453 took Constantinople and transformed it into what was becoming Istanbul, who transformed the Hagia Sophia into the mosque that we saw at the outset of this lecture. We see him represented many years later, though, around 1480, when the Venetian painter Gentile Bellini, the most important painter in Venice at the time, was sent to Istanbul on a cultural mission and spent 16 months there, so that there was interchange between the Ottoman Muslim world and the Venetian Christian world. And here we see that Bellini has represented the Sultan after he had conquered the city. And we recognize this as a symptom and a symbol of the interface between the two worlds, the European Christian and the Muslim Near Eastern world, mediated by Venice, whereby Venice brought portraiture to the Ottoman Turks and brought back from Ottoman Turkey paper marbling, which would become all the rage in Venice, in Italy, and eventually in Europe. This was a world through the late 15th century in which the Ottoman and Christian sides were in constant contact, often conflict, and clearly benefiting through cultural interface. Between those two powerhouses, Islam and Christendom, were sandwiched the Jews and Jewish culture. And what was happening with Jewish art and architecture during this period of intense interface will be the subject of our next talk.